Hi, welcome back. So, like I have mentioned in the previous lecture, we will discuss in this video lecture, we will talk about and will summarize firstly Meno, right? Plato's dialogue, Meno, and from there we will dwell more into certain issues and certain topics which needs certain topics which need intense analysis, and I think that would be the best start. And so, yeah, here we go. Meno. Obviously, I cannot go through everything, and I'm sure most of you have read Meno, and if you have not, I would encourage you to read Meno. I think it is a very interesting. I believe it's a very interesting work. It is one of my favorite works by Plato, and maybe I'm being biased to say this, but nevertheless, I think it is very interesting in the sense that you see nowadays we all need answers, right? Whenever we, for instance, whenever you get into a discussion with your friends, and you try to discuss about the problems that's facing the society or your life or whatnot, and then you have this opinion nowadays that if you can't, by the end of the conversation, if you can't have a certain solution to your problems, whatever the problems may be in your life, society, whatnot, if you can't derive some sort of solution to the problems which you have discussed, then nowadays people think that, well, it's useless, the conversation has been absolutely useless. But that is not so, because if we look at Plato, the whole dialogues of Plato and Socrates himself, we will find, and we will find that in none of the conversations, in none of the works, in none of the dialogues, Plato's dialogue, do we find a solution to anything, right? Or nor do we find any answers. You will never find answers. Maybe at the best, we will get some hint. We get some hint about what justice is, what virtue is, right? But never do we find, right? Never do we find Plato or Socrates saying, this is the answer. This is what justice is. This is what virtue is. And it is interesting. It is an interesting point, because if you look at, for instance, Aristotle, which we will realize, right, and it is very explicitly mentioned by Aristotle. For Aristotle, human knowledge is fallible, right? It is limited. It is incomplete. So we will never find a complete answer to some of the most pressing issues in our lives, in our society, especially when it comes to, for instance, trying to comprehend, say for instance, God, comprehend a supreme being, comprehend the truth, comprehending the virtue. So that's what it is. But nevertheless, that makes it even more interesting. You see, one of the most interesting things about these classical Greek philosophers is that there is no answer. Maybe we do get some hint, but other than that, we will not find any answer. And it is intentionally these Greek thinkers, for instance, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, it is by design, they intentionally made it so that it is up to the reader, it is up to those who are listening, that we should look into ourselves, look deep, examine deep within ourselves, and try to better ourselves as human beings. That is what the perfection of man is. Socrates, to Plato, and to Aristotle, right? In other words, ultimately, the ultimate question with regards to life, the ultimate questions with regards to the issues of politics, of society, of the state, of whatever it may be, it all boils down to you and me as an individual person, right? It is up to us to examine into ourselves and try to catch and try to look deep into ourselves and ask ourselves, maybe make ourselves even more uncomfortable, and then try to better comprehend and better comprehend, and also, if possible, let go of those beliefs which we hold to be true. Maybe the kind of beliefs that we hold is not right. Maybe we need some sort of changes in our view of things, in our view of the world. And that is precisely what they are meant to do. You see, the reason why, before I get into Meno, the reason why you never find a complete answer, nor do you find an answer, right, to any of the issues which we find in Plato or Socrates or whatnot, or Aristotle. The reason is because it makes us, the writer of in this case Plato, he wants us to see for ourselves on our own what is the right answer, right? What is the right answer? Instead of him imposing, right, imposing upon you a definite answer, he is rather asking us to see for ourselves, examine for ourselves, and find out by ourselves what the answer is, what the answers is to the question what is virtue, what is just, what is good, what is beautiful, what is the truth, and so on. So that's what great thinkers do. They make us examine ourselves. They make us examine those beliefs, those values, those norms, and those traditions and customs which we hold dear. Because in most cases and in most instances, much of what we believe in is actually uncritical. We uncritically believe and hold those values and customs to be true without examining it ourselves. And that is precisely what Plato wants us to do. He wants us to examine it. He wants us to see for ourselves that is it right? The definition I hold of justice, is it right? What I know to be of virtue, is it right? Examine it, right? And in the process of examining it, things may be very uncomfortable because you are challenging yourself. You are challenging those values, those core values that define, that constitute who you are as a person. And in questioning those values and beliefs which you hold to be true, which you have made those values to be part of yourself, it is very uncomfortable. But nevertheless, Plato and so as Socrates, they want us to examine for ourselves and find out what they truly are. So, getting back to the issue of Meno, in Plato's Meno, like we have discussed, and I'm sure you have read it. If you have not, I would urge you to read it. It's very interesting. In Meno, one of the primary character in the dialogue, apart from Socrates, we find that Meno, he hails from Thessaly, right? He's from a very aristocratic family, very wealthy and affluent family, and Thessaly, a city-state, is an ally, is friends with Athens and Athenian interests. So he comes and he visits Athens, and in his stay in Athens, he meets with Socrates. He meets up with Socrates. He goes up to him, and in most cases, in most dialogues, if you have read Plato, you'll find that in much of Plato's dialogue, you find that it is Socrates who initiates a conversation with the other characters, like you will find in, say, for instance, the Republic. However, in this case, and this is very, very rare in Plato's work. In this case, in this dialogue, it is the opposite. Here it is Meno that approaches Socrates and he imposes upon Socrates a question, right? And that is the key theme of the whole dialogue, right? And he asks Socrates, right? It's very, very interesting. He asks directly, he says, "Can you tell me, Socrates, can virtue be taught? Or is it not teachable but the result of practice? Or is it neither of this, but man possesses it by nature or in some other way?" In other words, Meno goes up to Socrates and he asks, now Socrates, tell me this. Can virtue be taught? Is it possible to teach virtue? Right? Is it possible to teach virtue? Or can one acquire virtue or become virtuous through practice? Or is one born with this innate quality to be virtuous? Or is it by nature that we have this virtue, by our very nature, that we possess some sort of nature in us that makes us virtuous? Right? That is the whole question. At first, Socrates, and later on in dialogue, he also mentions that it is rather baffling for him, because he tells Meno that, you see, it is not right to ask something if you can teach something when you don't even know what that something is. Like I've mentioned in the previous video lecture, and I'm going to repeat it once again. The thing is, he tells Meno that, now look here. I'm just paraphrasing it. I'm just trying to make things much clearer to you. The thing is this. He says, I cannot tell you whether we can teach, and he says it's wrong to even say that, can you teach virtue when we don't even know what virtue is. Now Socrates tells, Plato's Socrates he tells Meno that I don't know whether it is teachable or not. But also, we don't even know what virtue is. Right? So it's like you asking me, can I make, teach me, can you teach cooking? Right? Is cooking possible to be taught? Right? But then, if you don't even know what vegetables are, or what the purpose of cooking oil is, or do you not know how to use the spices, then if you have no idea about those preliminary and most basic and rudimentary items that goes into cooking, then it is rather irrelevant and rather stupid for you to ask me, or for me to ask you, can you teach me how to cook? Right? Or to ask, is it possible to teach how to cook? Right? So the thing is this. He says that, and then Meno is not satisfied with it. He says, regardless, I don't care. I just want to know whether you can teach me, or whether it is possible to teach how to cook, or not cook, but how to. Is it possible to teach virtue? So they go on talking, right? The conversation goes on, and in the conversation now, Socrates asked Meno, now then you tell me what virtues are. Now Meno mentions various kinds of virtues. He says there are various kinds of virtues for men, for women, for children, for elderly men. In other words, and I quote, there is virtue for every action and every age, for every task of ours and every one of us. Right? In other words, he's saying there are various kinds of virtues. But then Socrates is not satisfied. He then asks Meno, and he asks, okay, but there is one thing that is same, right? No matter what the virtues are, there is one thing that is same in all of them, regardless of what it is, regardless of what they are. There must be some common theme, some common strands, some common element, or some common factor that is present in all of those virtues, whatever that virtue may be. So for instance, to give you a quote, Socrates is replying to Meno. He says, did you not say that the virtue of a man consists of managing the city well, and that of a woman of managing the household? I did. Is it possible to manage a city well, or a household, or anything else without not managing it moderately and justly? Certainly not. Then, if they manage justly and moderately, then they must do so with justice and moderation, necessarily. So both the man and the woman, if they are to be good, need the same thing, justice and moderation. So it seems, what about the child and all men? Blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on. In other words, and so Socrates says, so all human beings are good in the same way, for they become good by acquiring the same qualities, right? And then Meno says, it seems so. And they would not be good in the same way if they did not have the same virtues. Certainly not. So in other words, Socrates asks Meno, okay, now, there must be some common strain. There must be some common factor or element that is common in all of those virtues which you have mentioned. And he says, in other words, Socrates is saying, okay, if a person is, if all the human beings are to be good in the same way, they have to acquire. If all human beings are good, they must be good in the same way. And Meno says yes. So Meno gets irritated with Socrates and says, okay, if you truly want that one single thing that is same in all, then I'll tell you what it is. And he says, and to Meno, that is to be able to rule, right? He says, to be able to rule over people. If you're seeking one description to fit them all. In other words, for Meno, that virtue, not a virtue, but virtue that is common in all of those virtues is, for Meno, able to rule over people, right? Being able to rule. But then Socrates says, is not satisfied, right? And they keep having this conversation back and forth, and then at last they come across what is known as the very famous episode with the slave, right? With Meno's slave. In other words, Socrates tells him, okay, fine, let's just forget about what the common thing is and whatever it is. Let me tell you one thing then. He says, and what he says is quite interesting, and I would suggest that you reread this over and over again. You see, he brings up Socrates in order to explain to Meno that there is such a thing as, that there is one thing that is common in all of those virtues which Meno has mentioned, and that there is such a thing as perfection, of whatever it may be, of man, of knowledge, of truth, of just, of virtue, whatnot. There is such a thing as a perfection of something, whatever that something is. And he brings up this issue of the soul, right? He says that for him, even before we were born, right, we existed in the form of a soul, whatever the soul may be. That soul is the perfection of man, or is the perfect you, perfect me. We existed, right, not here on this earth in a physical sense, but we have existed somewhere beyond the world, right? Not here in this world, but somewhere in the world. Not in the world, but beyond the world, maybe in heavens or whatever it is, someplace beyond the world. We have existed prior to our existence here on earth. Before you and I came here on this earth, we have lived somewhere, right? In the most perfect form of you, perfect form of me. And that perfect form of you and me, that's a soul, right? And what Socrates is telling Meno is that, you see, we existed somewhere, right? And that soul, the perfect you, the perfect me that had existed even prior to our existence here on earth, we possess all the knowledge, right, over there in our existence in our true form, which is not here on this earth but elsewhere. We know of everything, right? We know of the perfect knowledge. We know of the perfect definition, or we know perfectly well what the perfect virtue is, the perfect form of virtue, the perfect form of justice, the perfect form of beauty, the perfect form of triangles, the perfect form of rectangles, square, numbers, whatnot, right? So we know all these things. And it is just that we know all those knowledges when we possess all those knowledge when we are in the form of the soul. But when we are born here on this earth, right? When we are born here on this earth, we tend to we have it, but then we have forgotten, right? We know it, but then we need to remind ourselves of what they are, of those knowledge. We possess those knowledge. And by that he meant the recollection, right? It's very, very famous. If you have not read it, I suggest that you read it, and if you have read it, pay attention to it, right? He tells that we can recollect, right? We can remember of things which we know previously, right? For instance, say for instance, when I was young, I knew how to cook, right? I knew how to cook rice. Say for instance, when I was young, I knew how to cook rice. Now, after 20, 30 years, I have not cooked. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe I do not know how to cook rice. But then if I remember how I cooked when I was young, then I'm like, oh, okay, I do know how to cook actually, right? So I already possess the knowledge of cooking a rice, right, in me. So Socrates is telling us that, or Socrates is telling Meno that, you see, we do possess those knowledge. We have those knowledge. It is just a matter of remembering and recollecting it. Because, and to show what that means, Socrates he calls upon one of the slaves of Meno, and then he cautions the slave about a problem in geometry, right? In other words, how to find the square double in an area to any given square. So the issue here is this: the slave has no idea about mathematics, right? He has no clue about what geometry is. He has no idea what mathematics is. However, Socrates to show Meno that even this slave, in his soul, right, this slave before he was born here on earth, he possessed the knowledge of geometry, so he knows the answer. All we have to do now to that slave is just remind him, make him remember, make him recollect, remind him about the knowledge that he possesses, and he will tell us the answer. He may not know right now, but if we try to remind him, he can recollect the answer and tell us the answer. So what happens is that, guided by Socrates' question, so Socrates asks questions to him. So guided by his question, the slave who has never studied geometry, right, in his life before, comes to see for himself, right? The slave comes to see for himself and recognize the right answer to the problem, to the geometrical problem that he is given with, right? He's given with. So what he's trying to say is that we all possess the perfect knowledge. We all do have a certain idea, knowledge about the real, about the truth, about the absolute beauty, virtue, and whatnot. It is just a matter of reminding ourselves what it is. And so he uses the example of slave to show Meno that this is so, and that he must pay attention to that, right? And so then the conversation moves on from there, and then more and more Meno becomes more and more convinced. I mean, obviously, who wouldn't be, right? He is more and more convinced by the arguments set forth by, not arguments, but by the discussion, by the dialogue he's having with Socrates. And so they come across the issues of, okay, fine, let's come back to the key issue, right? So he says, well, obviously we have to somehow try to answer the question, right? Because ultimately the whole dialogue is based on the question about, can virtue be taught? Can you teach someone how to be virtuous? And in the process of this dialogue, they come to this agreement, right? They say that, okay, fine, we may not know, we don't know what virtue is. So obviously that's the difficulty on our part. We don't know what virtue is, but nevertheless we are trying to understand if we can teach what virtue is, right? What virtue is, we can teach that. That's the question, whether we can teach or not. So Socrates tries to, in a sense, hypothesize. It says this, okay, fine. To answer that question, let's do this, he says. So, but he makes it clear to Meno, right? He makes it very clear. When Plato is saying we can recollect, we can remember, by recollection of the things that we know, or by remembering, is not equivalent. It's not the same as teachable, right? Just because you can remember does not mean that it is teachable, right? It is up to the individual person to remember, to recollect, right? And it is not the same as teachability, right? It doesn't mean that it is teachable. So please bear that in mind. So Plato says, okay, fine. So if, say for instance, virtue, for instance, if you think that virtue is knowledge, if you have a knowledge, then you are virtuous. If virtue is knowledge or something else, then it must be good, right? It must be good. He said, yeah. So if the knowledge, if by virtue we mean knowledge, then it must be good. So if it is good, then it must be beneficial, right? If it is good, then it must be beneficial, because by the very concept of the good, it means something beneficial, right? So if it is beneficial, then it is beneficial only when we use it the right way, right? only when we use it the right way. And for instance, for example, he says courage. You may have courage, but then courage without wisdom is not good, right? It's bad. It's just recklessness. And courage with wisdom is good, right? Courage with wisdom is good. So if virtue is knowledge and knowledge is good, then it is beneficial. And it is beneficial because we should know how to use it the right way. And if we use it the right way, then virtue is knowledge, or virtue is wisdom. However, however, wisdom is not attainable, right? This is something that we have to remember. Wisdom is not. We can attain a very imperfect form of knowledge, imperfect form of wisdom, but the absolute wisdom we can never attain, right? That's what he says. That's what Socrates says. And if we can't have that absolute wisdom, then that means, if you can't have that means then wisdom is, then that means virtue is not knowledge. Because if it is knowledge, then we must be able to attain the full wisdom, the full knowledge, right? But because we are incapable of attaining the perfect wisdom, perfect knowledge, that means virtue is not knowledge. It's not knowledge. That virtue is not. Again, I emphasize this. That virtue is not knowledge. Now, here comes an interesting point. You see, after Socrates tells this to Meno, another character, another Athenian character by the name of Anytus, he comes by, and right now in the dialogue, Meno is staying with Anytus, right? Because Anytus is one of the leading, is a statesman, right? Is a politician in Athens. He's an Athenian politician, Athenian aristocratic family member. He is one of the ruling members of Athens. So he's staying with so Meno is staying with Anytus, and so Anytus comes in, and so Socrates asks Anytus, "Hey, Anytus, now that you're here, can you tell us if you can tell our friend Meno here if virtue is, if you can teach somebody how to be virtuous, right? Is it possible to teach how to be virtuous?" Anytus says, "Of course we can. Look at any of the Athenian men, right? You just stop by and ask any Athenian on the street, and they will teach you how to be virtuous, right? They will tell you how to be. They will teach you and they will make you virtuous, right?" But then Socrates tells Anytus, maybe that's not right. No, I don't think it's teachable. You see, because when you say that, and this is, I want you to remember, pay attention to this. He says, if you think that it is teachable, if you think the virtue is teachable, that means there must be somebody who knows. There must be a teacher of virtue, right? There must be a teacher of virtue. Because in order to teach someone, you need somebody who's a teacher, right? For instance, right now, political philosophy is teachable. Why? Because right now somebody, i.e. me, that is me, teaching you about political philosophy. If political philosophy is teachable, that means you need a teacher, right? And right now you have a teacher, me. So I'm teaching you. So it's teachable. So political philosophy is teachable. However, imagine that political philosophy is not teachable. If it is not teachable, that means in order for you to learn political philosophy, you need a teacher. And if there is no teacher, there is no learner, right? In other words, if there's no me, teacher, then there's no student, you, right? So in other words, in order for there to be a student, you need a teacher, right? If there's no teacher, there's no student. So that's what Socrates is saying. In other words, if you think that virtue is teachable, that means there must be a teacher of virtue, right? So Anytus says, yes, of course. Yeah. There are so many teachers of virtues. And so Socrates says, I don't think so. There are no teachers of virtue. And Socrates says, to prove to you, Anytus, that there are no teachers of virtue, that you will never find anyone to be a teacher of virtue, precisely because of this. He says this. He uses an example of Pericles, and He uses an example of Pericles and Themistocles, right? Those are some of the great figures in Athens, right? Those are the great Athenians. Whenever you talk about Athenians, the great Athenian citizens, that exude, that exemplify virtue and ethics, these are the people, right? Wisdom, these are the people, Pericles and Themistocles. So he says, well, you look at Pericles, right? The great Athenian, right? The great orator of Athens, right? The leading statesman in Athens. But look at his children. If virtue is teachable, then he would have taught, right? He would have taught his children how to be virtuous. But look at his children. His children are in no way as virtuous as Pericles. Same as Themistocles, right? Same thing with Themistocles. Look at him. He is someone whom we would say that he's a virtuous person, right? Virtuous person, full of wisdom. But look at his children. His children are in no way. His children do not measure up to the wisdom that he has, to the virtues that he possesses, to the virtues that he possesses. So Anytus gets angry, right? He gets angry. He says something bad and warns Socrates, and then he goes off. Right? And then he goes off. So after that, Socrates tells Meno, you see, my friend Meno, now there must be something about this, right? He says that. In other words, if from the examples which I've used of Pericles and Themistocles, if virtues are teachable, then these people, Pericles, Themistocles, they should have made their children. They should have made their children virtuous. Their children would be virtuous as Pericles, as Themistocles. But their children do not measure up. They do not measure up to the wisdom and ethics and virtues possessed by Themistocles and Pericles. Their children is a failure in terms of virtues, right? That means it is not teachable, right? And so he says, because they are not, and because virtue cannot be taught, that means there are no teachers. And if there are no teachers of virtue, that means there are no students of teachers. I mean, there are no students of virtues. And because there are no students of virtues, hence, virtue cannot be taught. Right? In other words, Socrates tells Meno that maybe something else, right? Maybe something else other than virtue, maybe something else other than knowledge is at work, right? He said maybe something else is missing and something else is at work which we have missed, right? That we have missed. And that, according to Socrates, that is what he calls as opinion, or a true opinion, or a true opinion, or a correct opinion, according to Socrates. And the thing is this. When he speaks of, when Socrates differentiates true opinion from knowledge, right? It's very important, and we will explain more and delve into this issue more in the next video lecture. But for now, I'll just tell you this. You see, there are two kinds of knowledges, right? For Socrates, for Plato, Socrates, and even for Plato. You have knowledge, which is the ultimate perfect form, right? Knowledge. And you have another form of knowledge, which is true opinion, right? Or a correct opinion, or a right opinion. Your opinion, right? And you have access to those opinions. How do you gain access to those opinions? According to Socrates, you gain access to those opinions, those correct opinions, those right opinions, when you try to recollect those things which you have learned in your past life, which you have learned when you were in the form of a soul, right? So he says, that is the true opinion. In other words, what he means by knowledge and true opinion is this. By knowledge, he means the theoretical knowledge, right? Of, there's a perfect form of society, perfect form of you, perfect me somewhere else in the heavens. a perfect justice, a perfect beauty, a perfect ugliness. Yeah, right. The perfect truth. Much in the same that's what knowledge is. However, there's another form of knowledge that is true or correct or right opinion. And by right opinion or the correct opinion, Socrates means, and we have a better understanding of what Socrates means when we look at Aristotle in his Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 6. Aristotle talks about what we know as practical wisdom, right? Practical wisdom. In other words, like how do I put this? Common sense, right? Common sense wisdom. That's the best way to translate it. So, for Socrates, you can either become you can either become, what virtue is and possess virtue, become virtuous, either through knowledge, which is not possible because ultimate form of knowledge is not possible. And some people do possess knowledge, and hence they can become virtuous. And for some, they possess true opinion or correct opinion. And by correct opinion, they means practical wisdom, right? Day-to-day wisdom, dealing with people, right? How do you deal with people, right? Right thing to say at the right moment, yes, right? How do you deal with difficult people in your life? How do you deal with, with your enemies? How do you deal with the people that you don't like? How do you deal with, different things in your life? Practical things. So by true opinion, he means the practical knowledge, right? What we do daily, day to day, right? So that's the correct opinion or the true opinion, right? And it is because some people, right? Even though what he's trying to say is that Pericles, persons such as Pericles, or such as Pericles and Themistocles, they do not have that theoretical knowledge, right? That knowledge that makes them virtuous. Their virtues, right? The virtues of these people, these great statesmen such as Pericles and Themistocles, they were able to become virtuous because of their true opinion, because of their correct opinion, right? In other words, because of the practical knowledge they possess, right? Maybe common sense knowledge, right? Maybe that's not the right word, but that's the best way to make you understand. Like practical knowledge. What do you do daily, right? You have to be practical. You have to be pragmatic, right? So that's what makes them virtuous. So for Socrates, you become virtuous either through life dedicated to the search of truth and knowledge, or through practical wisdom, i.e. true opinion. Okay, so that's summarizing what Meno is. So we'll end here for this video lecture, and in the next video lecture we will go more in depth and pick some essential points and dwell on that. Alright? Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.